What if an entire civilization was buried twice, once by nature and once by power? In the 18th and 19th centuries, cities across the world seemed to sink into the ground, doorways sealed in soil, windows staring out from beneath the street. Some say it was only urban planning. Others believe it was a cataclysm, the mud flood, that erased a world we were never meant to remember. And when the Earth finished its work, the Soviet Union began theirs, rewriting maps, silencing cultures, and erasing the very name of Tartaria from history. Could it be that both the soil and the state conspired to hide a forgotten empire? Tonight we'll walk through buried streets and vanished names, piecing together the traces of a world concealed in mud and memory. If mysteries like this intrigue you, subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten, and share in the comments where and when you are listening from tonight. The ground is heavy tonight. Imagine walking through a city street where the cobblestones shift faintly beneath your shoes, as though the earth itself is breathing. On either side, buildings rise, but their windows seem strangely low, some half buried in soil. What should have been the first floor lies hidden, sealed behind walls of dirt. These are not ruins in the way we expect them, crumbled and broken, but cities that appear to have sunk into the ground, swallowed whole. In the 18th and 19th centuries, travellers to places like St. Petersburg or Irkutsk often noted something unusual. Entire rows of windows opening directly onto the street, half their height below the level of the pavement. Were they basements converted into living rooms? Or were these once ground floors, later buried by a sudden catastrophe? Photographs from the mid-1800s show broad avenues lined with elegant facades, yet the doors stand oddly low, staircases leading downward instead of upward, as if the world had shifted its foundation. This is the haunting heart of the mud flood hypothesis. According to this idea, sometime in the 18th or early 19th century, a cataclysm of soil and silt rolled across entire regions of Eurasia, covering cities in a mantle of earth, raising the ground level by several meters in a matter of days or weeks. The cause remains a mystery. Some suggest earthquakes that liquefied the ground, others imagine sudden floods triggered by glacial collapse, while the most speculative claim a deliberate reset of civilization itself. Whatever the theory, the evidence offered is always the same. Architecture that seems out of place, out of alignment, and out of time. St. Petersburg offers the most famous examples. Built as Peter the Great's window to Europe, it should be a city of precise planning and design. Yet walk its older districts, and you will find countless examples of buried arches and sunken doors. In some courtyards, entire streets appear beneath the streets, brickwork intact, suggesting the city was not constructed atop ruins, but rather buried in a sudden layer of mud. Other cities of Russia tell the same story. Kazan, with its ornate mosques showing walls below ground level. Samarkand, where tiled facades seem to vanish into the earth. Irkutsk, where wooden houses reveal windows pressed against soil. The story is not confined to Russia. Across Europe, in Paris, in Vienna, in Warsaw, photographs reveal similar anomalies. In North America, San Francisco's Gold Rush-era buildings often show half-submerged entrances. Everywhere, the pattern repeats. Civilizations rising not atop rubble, but atop freshly buried ground, as if time had folded itself in layers of earth. Mainstream historians point to simpler explanations: changing street levels as cities modernized, the practice of raising roads for drainage, or architectural quirks of the period. And yet, when the pattern is mapped globally, a more uncanny picture emerges. How did so many cities across continents decide to bury their first floors at nearly the same time? Why do images from the 19th century show excavation not for new construction, but for revealing what already lay hidden? The mud flood is not a proven fact, but it is a haunting metaphor. A world half visible, half hidden. If Tartaria existed as a great civilization, this would be the moment it slipped beneath the surface. Not destroyed in fire or conquest, but muffled in soil, its streets entombed within the ground we now walk upon. And this is only the first silence. Later, another kind of burial would come, not in earth, but in words. Histories rewritten, maps redrawn, names erased. The Soviet Union would play its part in ensuring Tartaria remained a phantom. But before that, we must linger here, in the 18th and 19th centuries, among the buried windows and streets that whisper of a forgotten empire lost to mud. On the yellowed pages of old atlases, a name once stretched across nearly half of Asia. Great Tartary, it read, drawn in sweeping letters that crossed from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, from the Siberian tundra down into Central Asia. Before the word disappeared, it was not fringe or hidden. It was the way European scholars, cartographers, and diplomats understood the vast interior of the continent. To open a map of the 17th or 18th century was to encounter Tartaria as a certainty, as familiar as Persia or China. The maps of John Blow in the 1660s, carefully inked in Amsterdam, labelled the lands beyond Russia as Tartaria Magna. Guillaume de Lille, the celebrated French cartographer, published maps in the early 1700s showing Tartary divided into regions: independent Tartary and Chinese Tartary, Siberian Tartary. Even as late as the 1770s, encyclopedias described Tartary as one of the great landmasses of the world, inhabited by Mongol, Turkic, and nomadic peoples. Yet by the end of the 19th century, this name faded from maps, replaced by Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Manchuria. The word Tartaria slipped into obscurity, dismissed as a misunderstanding, a cartographic convenience used by Europeans who knew little about the peoples of the steppe. Was it truly nothing more than a geographic placeholder? Or was it the last public acknowledgement of a realm that once held coherence, a culture or civilization erased as borders hardened and empires rewrote the world? In some ways, Tartaria was both real and imagined. Real, in that it designated regions inhabited by diverse peoples: Tatars, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Mongols. Imagined in that European mapmakers often filled in the blanks of unknown interiors with sweeping names, shading deserts and mountains with embellishments of dragons, caravans, and walled cities they had never seen. But what lingers is not just the uncertainty of geography, it is the way an entire continent-wide identity could vanish, supplanted by new categories aligned with imperial power. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps is not a minor detail. Maps are not neutral records. They are instruments of authority. To redraw a border, to rename a land, is to reshape how future generations understand the past. When we see Tartaria dissolve into Russia or into China, we are not only watching a cartographic update, we are witnessing the reallocation of memory. What was once thought of as a distinct world is absorbed, its autonomy erased by lines of ink. For those who follow the trail of the mud flood, these maps become doubly haunting. They imagine that the maps of the 17th and 18th centuries preserved the last recognition of Tartaria as a true empire. Then, sometime in the 18th, 19th century, disaster struck, submerging its cities beneath layers of earth. As the ground covered its architecture, the atlases too were revised, burying its very name beneath newer labels. A civilization might be buried twice, once by mud and once by cartographers' pens. The motif of the erased name will recur, for even in the 20th century, when the soil had settled and new regimes ruled, the ghost of Tartaria appeared again in unexpected places. Documents, directives, even the secret archives of the CIA. But before we reach that revelation, we must dwell here, on the maps themselves, the silent witnesses that remind us how easily worlds can be renamed, and in renaming, forgotten. Picture a street being swallowed not by decades of erosion, but in a single season, perhaps even a single night. Walls vanish into rising soil, windows disappear beneath new ground, and doorways that once opened onto plazas now open onto silence. This is the central image of the mud flood hypothesis, a global event in the 18th or early 19th century that abruptly raised the ground level, entombing architecture under meters of mud and silt. The origins of the idea are obscure, circulating first in fringe writings, old photographs, and the curiosities of urban explorers. It is not found in mainstream textbooks, but in questions raised by anomalies. Why do so many 19th century photographs show men digging streets not for new buildings, but to reveal structures already buried? Why do official archives describe raising street levels without clear records of the catastrophe that made it necessary? Why are there so many basement windows that look less like design choices and more like remnants of a lost ground floor? In St. Petersburg, entire avenues of neoclassical palaces present this mystery. The Winter Palace, completed in 1762, is famous for its vast facade, yet visitors note that its lower arches and windows are partially submerged. In Irkutsk, travellers once described streets where wooden houses seem to grow from the soil, their lower stories pressed against earth. In Kazan, mosque courtyards reveal staircases descending to doors now blocked by dirt. The pattern repeats across Moscow, Samarkand, Novosibirsk. It is as though these cities were not built atop ruins, but preserved in place, and then suddenly buried. Geology offers explanations. Liquefaction, where saturated soil shakes like water during earthquakes, massive floods caused by glacial melting, landslides triggered by volcanic eruptions. These can bury settlements in mud quickly, as seen in Pompeii beneath ash, or the 1812 Caracas earthquake that swallowed entire streets. But the mud flood hypothesis extends further. It suggests not a local disaster, but a global one, synchronous across continents. The evidence its supporters claim is found in architectural patterns repeating from Paris to San Francisco, from Tokyo to Istanbul. Everywhere, the same anomaly. Buildings half buried, foundations deeper than expected, windows below the street. Skeptics argue the pattern reflects urban planning, not catastrophe. As cities modernized, drainage demanded streets be raised. Old ground floors became basements. In some cases, fires or floods did require rebuilding atop debris. But the hypothesis presses the question further. Why did so many cities, across cultures and empires, make the same decision in the same century? Why are there so few detailed records of the transformations? Was it simply overlooked or deliberately omitted? For those who believe in Tartaria, the mud flood was no accident of geology. It was the event that silenced an empire. Perhaps a natural disaster struck, but its scope was concealed. Perhaps a war, or even a technological accident, unleashed soil and slurry on an unimaginable scale. Or perhaps it was something more deliberate, a reset, engineered to erase a civilization and make way for the world we now inhabit. The truth may be beyond reach, but the imagery remains potent. A flood not of water but of earth, a tide of mud that does not wash cities away but swallows them whole, preserving their upper stories like floating islands above a sea of soil. To walk through such a city is to feel the weight of buried time, to imagine staircases leading not downward to cellars, but downward to another world. And just as the ground concealed Tartaria's streets, another kind of covering would come. This time not mud, but words. Not nature, but politics. The 20th century would see Tartaria erased again, this time not by earth, but by ink and decree. Walk slowly through St. Petersburg, and the story rises from the stones themselves. Along Nevsky Prospect, the proud avenue of Russia's imperial capital, ornate facades gleam in pastel colours, mint green, rose pink, ivory white. Yet beneath these flourishes, half hidden by pavement and shadow, lie doorways and arches pressed against the earth. Some windows gaze directly into the street at ankle height, their frames crowded by soil. Tourists pass them by without pause, but to those who linger, they look less like basements and more like the ghosts of a buried ground floor. In the 19th century, photographs captured scenes of excavation across the city. Men in heavy coats stand with shovels before entire walls emerging from the ground. These images show not construction, but revelation, the uncovering of buildings already complete, only hidden beneath layers of mud. Why would so many structures need to be dug out? Why do entire districts appear to rest lower than the modern streets that frame them? Kazan tells a similar story. Once a center of Tatar culture, its mosques and schools reveal anomalies. The Nurullah Mosque, for example, presents its lower arches buried beneath ground level, staircases leading downward into entrances that seem far too elegant to belong to cellars. Some scholars argue that urban development raised the street level. Yet the effect is uncanny. An entire religious quarter pressed downward, as if a tide of soil swept through and settled permanently. In Samarkand, the turquoise domes of Registan rise majestically, dazzling mosaics glittering under the sun, but closer inspection reveals walls whose base disappears into packed earth, and courtyards where doorways sit too low, steps sinking into silence. Archaeological surveys note sediment deposits, though the reports are inconclusive. Was it centuries of wind-blown dust, or something more abrupt? Irkutsk, deep in Siberia, offers wooden houses with curious features, rows of windows peering just above the ground, half their height already claimed by soil. Locals call them sunken houses, but explanations vary. Fires, floods, or the constant swelling and freezing of the permafrost could shift the earth. Yet to some they are part of the same pattern stretching across continents, a testimony to a flood of mud that spared the rooftops but swallowed the streets. Even outside Russia, echoes appear. In Warsaw, in Vienna, in San Francisco, old photographs reveal cityscapes with strangely buried ground floors. In one image from Paris, men dig a trench not to lay foundations, but to expose ornate windows that had vanished beneath soil. The recurrence unsettles the neat lines of history. If this happened everywhere, was it a coincidence of architecture or the scar of an event we have forgotten? For believers in the Tartarian Empire, these buried cities are not just curiosities. They are ruins of a civilization erased in two stages, first physically, by mud, later politically, by narrative. Every window pressed against the earth becomes an accusation. Every staircase that leads downward to a doorway blocked by dirt becomes a silent reminder that what we see may not be all that once existed. And yet, buried cities also preserve secrets. Just as Pompeii lay hidden until excavation revealed its streets frozen in time, so too might Tartaria remain beneath our feet waiting. What would we find if we dug deeper than the first row of windows? What histories lie in cellars that were never meant to be basements? The silence of soil is not final. It is only the first veil. The second veil will be of words, of rewritten chronicles, of maps altered to erase a name. And that story belongs to the survivors, the ones who lived through the mud and carried fragments of memory into the next age. If an empire was swallowed by mud, did its people vanish too? Or did they scatter like seeds on the wind, carrying fragments of their culture into new lands? The mud flood hypothesis is often told through architecture. Windows submerged, arches buried. But civilizations are more than stone. They are languages, customs, memories that move through human lives. To search for survivors of Tartaria is to look not just beneath the ground, but within the patterns of people who remained. On the steppes of Central Asia, the descendants of Tatars, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Uzbeks tell stories of upheaval. Legends speak of cities that sank into the earth overnight, or of lands consumed by storms of dust. Among the Turkic peoples, myths of golden palaces swallowed by the ground linger, sometimes explained as divine punishment, sometimes as the work of unseen forces. These are not framed as mud floods in the modern sense, but they echo the motif of sudden burial. Themes that whisper of collective memory disguised as folklore. Genetic studies add another dimension. Ancient DNA reveals ghost populations across Eurasia, traces of peoples who once lived between Siberia and the Caspian Sea, whose genetic signals do not perfectly match any modern group. Some of these lineages appear abruptly, suggesting migrations or displacements. Were they wanderers forced from cities drowned in mud? Or is this coincidence the natural churn of nomadic life on the steppe? We cannot be sure, but the overlap tempts speculation that the survivors of a lost empire blended into new tribes, their identity dissolved into larger currents of history. There are material hints as well. In Tashkent, old chronicles mention districts abandoned after strange earth movements in the 18th century. In Bukhara, once famed as a centre of Islamic scholarship, elders tell of mosques with lower levels sealed long ago, their purposes forgotten. Even in the Caucasus, tales persist of underground halls and chambers filled with stonework that locals claim predates the Russian conquests. Survivors perhaps turned ruins into shelters, reusing structures partially submerged until memory itself became submerged. The Mongols, too, carry fragments of this silence. Though historians link their empire to Genghis Khan and the 13th century, Later ethnographers recorded stories of giant cities across the steppe, places now invisible. Were these stories exaggerations of ruins half buried in mud? Or did nomads inherit fragments of a narrative older than their own? When survival depends on movement, memory may endure in songs and stories rather than in walls and stone. The motif repeats, lives continuing even after landscapes are transformed. Just as the survivors of Atlantis are said to have carried fragments of knowledge to Egypt or the Andes, the survivors of Tartaria, if they existed, may have carried their traditions into the tapestry of Central Asia, leaving behind only scattered hints. A prayer whispered in a language that no longer has a homeland. A carving whose style does not match its time. A settlement pattern that makes sense only when traced back to a city that is no longer visible. What unites these fragments is not certainty, but suggestion. Survivors leave echoes rather than declarations. Their lives become woven into the identities of new nations until the original thread is almost invisible. But like DNA hiding in the genome, or a loanword that outlives its parent tongue, Tartaria may still breathe in the margins of cultures across Eurasia. If there were survivors, they would not only have lived through mud, they would have lived through erasure. For as the ground covered their cities, the maps too would begin to change. And the survivors would find themselves not only without a homeland, but without a name. Every culture has a story of a place that was lost, consumed by flood, swallowed by fire, or buried beneath the earth. These tales are not just entertainment, they are memory disguised as myth. If Tartaria was truly erased, then perhaps its shadow still lives in folklore, retold as cautionary stories or woven into religious parables. To hear them is to glimpse what history no longer records. The Greeks spoke of Atlantis, a shining empire submerged by the sea in a single day and night. The Hindus described Dwarka, the golden city of Krishna, drowned beneath the ocean, only to be rediscovered millennia later beneath the waters off Gujarat. The Norse remembered Ragnarok's floods and fires, after which a new world would rise. Among the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, legends tell of lands suddenly engulfed by sandstorms, leaving only domes and towers visible above the dunes. In Siberia, the Evenki people tell of villages swallowed by the earth after great rumblings, their inhabitants never seen again. These stories form a pattern, one repeated across continents. The world is not permanent. It can shift, crack, and collapse without warning. For believers in Tartaria, such myths are not coincidences. They are fragments of a larger truth. Humanity has lived through cycles of destruction, and Tartaria was only the latest to fall. The mud flood becomes one more chapter in the library of catastrophes, a catastrophe recast in folk memory as divine punishment or natural upheaval. Even within Russia itself, echoes survive. Russian folk songs speak of cities of gold that vanished underground. Tales from the Urals describe miners finding vast chambers sealed beneath earth, their builders unknown. Cossack oral histories mention stone walls on the steppe, ruins that sank into the ground long before the empire reached them. These whispers are easily dismissed as exaggerations. Yet when compared with buried doorways and sealed basements in actual cities, the line between myth and observation blurs. Archaeology sometimes lends weight to these legends. In Samarkand and Bukhara, excavations have revealed lower layers of construction beneath medieval streets, entire foundations pressed under sediment. In Central Asia's deserts, geoglyphs etched into the soil hint at vanished cultures whose identities remain unknown. Though mainstream scholarship connects these finds to known peoples, those who follow the Tartarian mystery see them as remnants of a once great civilization, its memory surviving only in allegory. The danger of myth is also its power. It resists closure. Unlike chronicles, which can be rewritten, myths endure precisely because they are flexible. They can be retold in different eras, shifting their form while preserving their essence. If Tartaria was buried twice, once in mud, once in memory, then myth may be its last refuge, a way of saying without saying. Consider this. Why do we tell and retell stories of lost lands? Why do cultures across the world preserve the same motif of sudden disappearance? Perhaps it is because we have lived through it before, more times than we remember. perhaps Tartaria is not an exception, but part of a cycle, a recurring reminder that civilizations, no matter how vast, may fall in silence. And silence in the 20th century would no longer come from myth alone. It would come from political power, from ink on paper, from decrees that reshaped entire histories. The Soviets would pick up where the mud flood left off, burying not cities but narratives. By the middle of the 20th century, the mud had long since settled. Streets were paved, cities rebuilt, and life carried on as if nothing strange had ever happened. Yet another burial was still to come, one not of earth, but of words. Where the ground had hidden buildings, politics would hide memory. And it was the Soviet Union that wielded the pen. On August 9, 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union issued a directive that would alter the past. Its language was precise, almost bureaucratic. Historians in the Tatar Autonomous Republic were to carry out a scientific revision of local history. They were instructed to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character. In practice, this meant erasing references to aggression by Russia, downplaying Tatar heritage, and reshaping the story to ensure Moscow appeared always as the rightful centre. Tartaria, once named in maps and chronicles, would now be dissolved into Russia's own narrative. This was not an isolated case. Across the Soviet Union, minority histories were rewritten to suit the needs of the state. In Central Asia, ancient cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were reframed as stepping stones towards socialism, their independent identities diminished. In the Caucasus, local traditions were scrubbed clean of anything that might challenge Moscow's authority. But the directive of 1944 stands out because it explicitly targeted Tartarian history. A name once stretched across continents was reduced to a provincial footnote, its memory recast as error. The effect was not only on paper. Libraries withdrew books that told older versions of the past. School children were taught that their ancestors had always been part of a Russian destiny. Museums quietly removed artifacts that suggested alternative narratives. The living memory of Tartaria, if any still remained, was pruned until only silence remained. Where mud had hidden the lower floors of cities, Soviet decree hid the lower layers of history. The parallel is striking. Just as architects of empire raise new streets atop the old, so too did the party raise a new past atop the ruins of memory. And just as basements masquerade as ground floors, so too did rewritten histories masquerade as truth. Those who tried to preserve fragments, local scholars, storytellers, devout families, often faced suspicion, exile, or worse. For those who trace the enigma of Tartaria, this moment is pivotal. Even if the mud flood were only myth, the Soviet rewrite is undeniable. A documented act of erasure carried out in plain sight. It shows how easily entire narratives can be controlled, reshaped and buried, not by natural forces, but by ideology. And yet, history has a way of resisting. Just as mud leaves behind stratified layers that archaeologists can one day uncover, so too do archives conceal forgotten truths. Decades after the Soviet directive, a classified report in the United States would quietly preserve the forbidden word, Tartaria. When the CIA declassified that report in 1999, it was like finding a window beneath the soil, a glimpse into a flaw that had never entirely vanished. But before turning to that discovery, we must pause and consider the scale of silence. If an empire can be erased from maps, rewritten in textbooks, and reduced to rumour, then what else might have been rewritten out of existence? In the quiet halls of American intelligence, among folders stamped with the stark word classified, there existed a document unlike the usual blueprints of war or networks of spies. Its subject was culture. Its target was ideology. And hidden within its pages, like a fossil pressed into stone, lay a name most of the world had already forgotten, Tartaria. The report was titled National Cultural Development Under Communism. Written in June of 1957, at the height of the Cold War, it was not released to the public until August 24, 1999. By then, the Soviet Union had collapsed, its archives were opening, and the American file emerged into the light like an artifact long concealed. For those who believe in the mystery of Tartaria, this document became an anchor, a piece of hard evidence amid swirling speculation. For here, in dry official language, the CIA acknowledged not only the Soviet suppression of minority cultures, but also the existence of Tartaria as something more than myth. The prose is matter-of-fact, even bureaucratic. It describes how the Bolsheviks promised freedom of religion and culture to Muslim and Turkic peoples in 1917, only to betray those promises within a decade. It lists the mosques confiscated, the alphabets forcibly changed, the brotherhoods outlawed, the leaders exiled or executed. The rhythm of the report is statistical, almost cold, but between the lines lies a devastating portrait of cultural amnesia, deliberately manufactured. And then comes the revelation, the mention of Tartaria, not as rumour or legend, but as a country, an identity targeted for revision and liquidation. Imagine the impact on those who discovered this detail decades later. A civilization erased from maps by the late 19th century, erased from textbooks by the 20th, yet still present in a classified file, its name quietly haunting the pages of Cold War intelligence. To conspiracy researchers, this was not coincidence. It was confirmation. Tartaria had once been real enough to appear in the archives of two superpowers, first as a subject of Soviet revision, then as an object of American observation. The file is particularly striking in its reference to the Soviet directive of August 9, 1944. It notes that the Central Committee in Moscow ordered a scientific revision of Tatar history aimed at eliminating shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character. In plainer words, historians were commanded to falsify the past, to remove references to Russian aggression, to downplay the independence of Tatar culture, to present the Russian state as eternal and benevolent. The CIA analysts, reading this directive in the 1950s, recognized it as propaganda. What they may not have recognized, or what they chose not to say, is that this act of erasure went deeper than politics. It was the burial of an identity that on maps only a century earlier had been vast enough to cover half of Asia. The contrast between the CIA's tone and the weight of its content is eerie. On one page, the report describes quotas for religious publications. On another, it coolly observes the destruction of cultural memory. And then, almost casually, it names Tartaria. The effect is like finding a ghost in a census list, a whisper among ledgers and statistics. For those who search for Tartaria, this moment is electrifying, the forgotten empire still alive in ink, even as both nature and politics had conspired to silence it. Consider the imagery. The mud flood, if real, had buried buildings, pressing streets beneath soil, turning proud doorways into sealed chambers. Decades later, the Soviets buried names, pressing memory beneath ideology, turning histories into propaganda. And in both cases, the CIA document becomes the equivalent of a window left half exposed, a glimpse into what lay below. The file is not poetry, but its presence is haunting. One can picture an analyst in 1957 typing Tartaria into his report, unaware that he was preserving the word for another generation, unaware that decades later, researchers would seize upon that line as proof of a deeper mystery. The timing of the declassification adds another layer. In 1999, the internet was beginning to connect scattered communities of researchers, skeptics, and dreamers. Scans of the report began circulating in online forums devoted to forbidden archaeology, lost civilizations, and the hidden past. To mainstream historians, it was a curiosity, an artifact of outdated nomenclature. To those who believed in the mud flood and the erased empire, it was dynamite. Here was the CIA, the most secretive of agencies, inadvertently acknowledging that Tartaria was not entirely myth. Examples multiplied. Researchers compared the CIA report with 18th and 19th century maps, noting the continuity of the name. They highlighted Soviet-era encyclopedias in which Tartary abruptly disappeared, replaced by regional designations. They connected these dots to the broader Soviet policy of cultural suppression, noting how entire languages were altered by decree, alphabets switched overnight. If such sweeping erasures could happen in the 20th century, why not in the 19th? Why not to Tartaria itself? The CIA file also described the fate of Islamic institutions: mosques closed, schools converted, leaders deported. This section, while not directly about Tartaria, resonates with the pattern of erasure. A civilization's memory is not only in its monuments but in its practices, its faith, its rhythms of daily life. To dismantle these is to bury the intangible floor beneath the tangible. The parallels to the mud flood are almost poetic. Just as soil covered the lower levels of architecture, censorship covered the lower levels of culture, until only the upper stories, the official narrative, remained visible. One might imagine wandering into the National Archives in the late 1990s, opening the declassified file, and seeing the word Tartaria emerge like a relic from beneath layers of paper. It would feel like unearthing an artifact, a shard of pottery protruding from soil, hinting at an entire buried city. Except here, the soil is not earth but bureaucracy, and the shard is a word in typewriter ink. The CIA document does not prove Tartaria was an empire of free energy or global cities. It does not reveal star forts or lost technologies, but it does prove something simpler and perhaps more unsettling, that the name persisted longer than we thought, that it was real enough to be targeted, real enough to be noted, real enough to require erasure. That alone demands reflection, for if Tartaria could vanish so completely from public knowledge, appearing only as a ghost in a secret file, what else might have been buried, smothered, or erased? How many civilizations have slipped beneath the dual weight of soil and silence, leaving behind only whispers in stone and stray mentions in forgotten reports? The mud flood may have buried the physical world, the Soviet rewrite may have buried the memory, but the CIA document remains, a fragile crack in the wall of silence, reminding us that erasure is never absolute. Beneath every layer, traces endure, and those traces are enough to keep the mystery alive, long after the empire itself has gone. Civilizations are built on more than stone and mortar. Their true foundations are intangible: rituals whispered at dawn, the cadence of prayers, the rhythm of festivals, the stories passed from elder to child. Architecture may be buried in mud, maps may be redrawn with new names, but when faith and memory are dismantled, a culture's deepest roots are severed. In the Soviet Union, this process was carried out not by accident, but with deliberate, systemic precision. The Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, proclaiming freedom. Their decree of December 7th of that year promised Muslims and other minorities complete liberty to practice religion, to preserve customs, to govern their cultural life in freedom. Article 3 of a later law, in 1918, went so far as to guarantee the free practice of any faith, or none at all. At first glance, these were bold words of liberation, especially to communities long suppressed under the Tsar. But history shows how swiftly those words dissolved. Within a few years, those guarantees became meaningless, replaced by measures that suffocated the very practices they had sworn to protect. The statistics speak loudly. Before the revolution, there were approximately 7,000 mosques in European Russia alone. This number did not even count the thousands more scattered across Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Crimea. Tashkent had over 300 mosques, Samarkand more than 100, Bukhara 360, Almaty countless small houses of worship. Yet by the 1940s, Soviet records admitted only 1,212 mosques remained in the entire Union. Whole cities were left without a single functioning mosque. In Almaty, not one survived. In Ashgabat, Stalinabad, and many other centres, the skyline that had once glistened with minarets was bare. The campaign was more than architectural destruction. Leaders of faith were systematically targeted. Imams, mullahs, and teachers were arrested, deported, or executed. Brotherhoods were outlawed, cutting off networks that had bound communities together for centuries. Families who openly identified as devout faced discrimination, dismissal from work, or worse. Those who persisted were forced underground, practicing their rituals in hidden rooms, whispering their prayers in fear. The assault extended into language and literacy. In 1929, Soviet authorities decreed the change of alphabets, from Arabic to Latin, and later from Latin to Cyrillic. Overnight, entire libraries became unreadable to younger generations. Religious texts, once studied and copied, now lay silent, their scripts foreign to those born under new orthographies. Even the Quran itself became inaccessible. Manuscripts were confiscated or destroyed. Printing new ones was forbidden. The effect was devastating. Imagine a child growing up unable to read the language of their grandparents, unable to decipher the sacred texts their culture had preserved for centuries. An alphabet is not only letters, it is a bridge across time. To cut that bridge is to isolate a generation from its past. The cultural losses were not limited to Islam. In regions where Tartaria once spanned, folk traditions, songs, and storytelling practices were suppressed if they did not conform to socialist ideals. Local histories were rewritten to portray Russia as savior, minorities as dependent or primitive. Museums curated exhibits not to honor local cultures, but to present them as quaint preludes to socialism. Even costumes and instruments were staged in choreographed performances that drained them of their deeper meaning. Faith was replaced with spectacle. Memory was replaced with narrative control. Imagine walking through Bukhara in the 1930s. Once the city's skyline had been crowded with domes and minarets, courtyards filled with the hum of scholars reciting texts, markets alive with the rhythms of prayer times. Now, mosques stood locked or converted to storage. The call to prayer no longer echoed from the minaret. Instead, the sound was silence, broken only by the shuffle of guards or the propaganda broadcasts filling public squares. The transformation was not gradual, it was abrupt, enforced, total. The cultural heart of the city had been deliberately stopped. The CIA report of 1957 recorded these shifts in detail. It noted not only the closing of mosques, but the strategy behind it, the deliberate weakening of communities through cultural amnesia. The report described how religious leaders were eliminated, how education was restructured to exclude religious study, how publications were censored until even the memory of alternative narratives faded. For analysts in Langley, this was evidence of communist control. For those who search for Tartaria, it is evidence of something more profound. A systematic burial of identity, one that parallels the physical burial suggested by the mud flood. It is here that the metaphor deepens. Just as mud pressed against windows, rendering ground floors invisible, Soviet decrees pressed against culture, rendering memory inaccessible. Both are layers of silence, both are veils laid over the past. In one, soil filled the streets. In the other, ideology filled the pages of textbooks. Together they created a void where once a vibrant world had stood. And yet, as with buried architecture, fragments endured. Families hid Qurans inside walls or beneath floorboards, risking imprisonment to preserve them. Elders whispered proverbs in their native tongues, teaching children secretly, even when schools forbade it. Oral traditions persisted, carrying stories of lost cities, of towers swallowed by earth, of ancestors erased by conquerors. In these fragments, a civilization survived, not visibly, but quietly, in the breath of those who refused to forget. Consider the imagery of a closed mosque in Tashkent. Its doors are chained, its courtyard overgrown with weeds, its once ornate tiles chipped and faded. Officially, it is no longer a place of worship, but a warehouse, filled with grain sacks or machinery. Yet at night, perhaps, a family approaches quietly, slipping inside through a broken window. In the shadows they recite prayers softly, their voices nearly drowned by silence. This is not just survival, it is defiance. It is memory refusing to die. The erasure of faith was also the erasure of Tartaria. For what was Tartaria, if not the sum of its people, their rituals, their prayers, their languages? When mosques were sealed and leaders exiled, the identity of Tartaria was sealed with them. The mud flood may have buried the stones, but the Soviet regime buried the living memory. Each was an act of silencing, different in method but similar in outcome. and so the cycle of erasure repeated. Streets buried, names erased, faith dismantled, memory scattered. By the middle of the 20th century, Tartaria no longer appeared on maps, no longer rang from minarets, no longer shaped the lives of its descendants in open daylight. It existed only in whispers, private prayers, hidden manuscripts, fading proverbs. Yet silence is never complete. Just as archaeologists can scrape away layers of soil to uncover a lost street, so too can memory be uncovered, even after decades of repression. The CIA document itself is proof, a fragment of acknowledgement preserved by accident that reveals the scale of what was erased. And beyond documents, the resilience of human spirit ensures that even in the harshest repression, some echoes survive. Faith, like architecture, can endure burial. Memory, like language, can resist silencing. And when both are attacked, the fragments that remain become precious. They are the seeds from which questions grow, the whispers that challenge official history, the clues that keep mysteries alive. In Tartaria's story, erasure of faith and erasure of memory are inseparable. They are two sides of the same flood, one of mud, one of silence. Together they form the second burial, the one carried out not by nature but by decree. And from this burial arises the paradox. The more thoroughly something is erased, the more fiercely its absence haunts us. Stand before the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Its endless facade stretches in pale green and white, adorned with gilded trim, Corinthian columns, and ornate sculptures. Official history tells us it was built in the mid-18th century, designed by Bartolomeo Rastrelli for Empress Elizabeth. But pause a moment. The sheer scale, 1,500 rooms, colossal stone blocks, vast halls, seems to belong to another age. Could such a structure truly have risen in just a few decades, in a swampy city barely founded a century before? Questions like these lie at the heart of the so-called Tartarian architecture. Around the world, in the 18th and 19th centuries, buildings appeared with domes and arches of staggering precision, ornamentation so intricate it defies explanation. Exhibition halls, train stations, palaces, and museums built in this period share a vocabulary of grandeur. Massive vaulted ceilings, resonant acoustics, and powerfully symmetrical designs. For many, these were the products of empire and industry. For others, they look like remnants, repurposed artifacts from a civilization far older. Consider the Crystal Palace of London, constructed for the Great Exhibition of 1851. A cathedral of glass and iron, it astonished visitors with its size and light, a marvel even by modern standards. Mainstream accounts celebrate it as an achievement of Victorian ingenuity. Yet some whisper, was it truly invented, or was it inherited? Did engineers uncover techniques already embedded in forgotten knowledge, relics of Tartaria's mastery over energy and form? In Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 displayed the White City, an ensemble of colossal neoclassical buildings, so grand that visitors thought a new Rome had been built overnight. Yet within months, most of it was destroyed by fire, leaving only photographs and memories. For believers, the speed of its disappearance suggests something uncanny, that the fair was staged not as a celebration, but as a controlled unveiling of architecture too advanced to be explained, followed by its deliberate erasure. Across Russia, the pattern repeats. The Kazan Cathedral, the Moscow Manege, the Bolshoi Theatre, each monumental, each appearing in an era supposedly constrained by horse-drawn transport and hand-cut stone. How were these feats achieved so quickly, so widely, and with such uniform sophistication? Were they truly new creations or refurbishments of structures left behind? The question lingers like the half-buried windows of St. Petersburg, an architectural riddle pointing to deeper strata of history. Skeptics counter that industrial advances in the 18th and 19th centuries, combined with imperial wealth, explain these wonders. Stone was quarried in unprecedented volumes, iron and steel became tools of progress, and armies of labourers worked at immense human cost. But for the alternative narrative, the pieces fit differently. These were Tartarian buildings, already standing, repainted and repurposed, renamed to fit the new empire's story. And then there are the domes, those great onion domes of Russian churches glittering in gold and cobalt. Some see them not only as aesthetic choices, but as functional devices, antennas of a forgotten energy system, once channeling power from the ether. The theory is speculative, unproven, but evocative. Architecture as technology, buildings as machines, cities as power grids. Whatever interpretation one chooses, the impression is undeniable. These structures feel out of time, too advanced, too sudden, too global in their spread. They are monuments that do not fully belong to the centuries that claim them. And just as maps erased Tartaria's name and decrees erased its memory, so too may architecture have been repurposed to erase its origins. To stand before them is to face a paradox. Are we looking at the triumph of known empires, or the bones of one that was buried twice, once in mud and once in history? The question grows heavier when we widen the lens. For buried buildings and anomalous architecture are not confined to Russia or Europe. Across the oceans, in America, Asia, and beyond, the same motifs emerge. Could the mud flood have been not just a regional disaster, but a global layer of silence? If the mud flood were merely a local disaster, confined to Russia or Central Asia, perhaps it could be explained away as geology or the quirks of urban planning. But the anomalies stretch farther, across oceans, across continents. In city after city, the ground seems to tell the same story. Buildings half buried, foundations deeper than they should be, doorways leading down into silence. It is as though the earth itself rose in the 18th and 19th centuries, a global tide of soil leaving traces everywhere it touched. San Francisco offers some of the most striking examples. Photographs from the mid-1800s show streets lined with Victorian houses, yet many of their doors open several feet below the present street level. Windows peak just above the pavement, as though the houses were not designed with basements but later smothered by earth. Following the Great Fire of 1906, excavations revealed entire lower stories beneath the city, intact, their existence unrecorded in official plans. Why were they hidden? Was this rebuilding or unburying? In Paris too, the mystery lingers. Old prints show boulevards lined with elegant Haussmannian facades, but contemporary accounts speak of excavation work not for construction, but for clearing mud from existing buildings. Vienna and Prague reveal the same curious pattern: grand buildings with half-sunken windows, staircases descending instead of rising, hints of a ground floor lost to time. Travel farther east, and the anomalies persist. In Tokyo, certain Meiji-era structures appear raised above buried foundations. In Istanbul, Ottoman mosques reveal substructures pressed beneath earth, their arches and chambers sealed away. Even in South America, cities like Buenos Aires contain blocks where entire facades appear misaligned with the modern street, as if swallowed by a forgotten surge of mud. Geology struggles to provide a unified explanation. Local floods, fires, earthquakes. Yes, each might bury a neighborhood. But how to explain the near-simultaneous appearance of this pattern across so many cultures, languages, and empires? Mainstream historians argue that the 19th century was simply an age of rapid urban transformation. Streets raised for sanitation, cities rebuilt on rubble. Yet for those who follow the mud flood hypothesis, the scale feels larger, more synchronized, more deliberate. The global layer becomes a metaphor. Imagine the earth itself shrugging, as if tired of its surface, smothering the works of humankind beneath a blanket of soil. Imagine not just one city, but dozens, hundreds, suddenly finding their ground floors turned into cellars. Imagine the silence afterward. No chronicles, no official acknowledgement, only photographs and whispers. If Tartaria were real, this global layer would be its grave. Not the conquest of one empire over another, but the settling of the earth itself, swallowing streets, towers, and squares until only the upper stories remained. A burial without ceremony, witnessed everywhere, yet recorded nowhere. And still, traces break through. Just as the CIA document revealed a forgotten word, so too do buried windows and sunken arches reveal a forgotten world. If the mud flood was global, then perhaps Tartaria was too, less a single empire, more a network of cultures erased in unison. The Soviets may have rewritten one chapter, but the Earth had already erased the library. What would it mean if an entire layer of civilization lay beneath us, not in isolated ruins, but as a stratum stretching across the planet? What if history as we know it is simply the surface layer, a recent reconstruction atop the silence of the soil? The answer may be found not in dirt alone, but in ink. For while buildings could be hidden beneath earth, maps could be redrawn, names erased, and an entire identity made to vanish from the world's imagination. And that brings us to another silence, the phantom of maps, where Tartaria itself fades away. Open an atlas from the 17th century, and the word leaps out in bold lettering, Tartaria, sprawling across Eurasia like a continent of its own. Turn the pages forward in time, and the letters shrink, shift, and fracture. Great Tartary becomes independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Siberian Tartary. By the mid-19th century, the name fades into smaller corners, confined to regions considered peripheral. And then, by the dawn of the 20th century, it is gone. Where once a name stretched across half the world, there is now only Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Manchuria. This disappearance is not a natural evolution of geography, it is a phantom erasure. Maps are not mere reflections of the world, they are declarations of power. To label a territory is to claim authority over it. To erase a label is to dissolve the very idea of its existence. When Tartaria vanished from maps, it did more than yield to modern accuracy. It lost its place in the human imagination. Cartographers of the Enlightenment had drawn Tartaria with confidence, even when details were vague. They filled its lands with illustrations of yurts, caravans, horsemen sweeping across the steppe. The blankness was not empty, it was alive with the presumption of a distinct world. Yet by the 19th century, imperial powers demanded precision. Russia expanded its borders eastward, claiming Siberia, China asserted authority over Manchuria, Britain cast its shadow over Central Asia. Tartaria, as a category, no longer served the empires, so it was redrawn, dismembered, absorbed. The effect on memory was profound. Schoolchildren in Paris or London no longer read of Tartary as a place. Travellers no longer spoke of entering its lands. By the time the 20th century arrived, the very word sounded antiquated, like a relic of medieval fancy. Those who uttered it seemed out of step with modern scholarship. An empire can be erased not only by conquest, but by silence. For those who trace the mystery, the cartographic fade aligns eerily with the architectural anomalies of the mud flood. As buildings were buried under soil, the name was buried under ink. Two layers of concealment, one geological, one political. A double burial that ensured Tartaria would be remembered, if at all, as little more than rumour. Yet the ghost lingers. Even as maps deleted the word, even as classrooms ignored it, the CIA document of 1957 brought it back, like a whispered echo. The Soviets themselves had once worried enough to rewrite its history, proof that the phantom still had weight, and in the margins of folklore, in the sunken windows of old cities, in the half-legible inscriptions of forgotten manuscripts, Tartaria refuses to die completely. Perhaps this is how lost civilizations endure, not in clear records, but in phantoms. Atlantis is a phantom in Plato's dialogues. Hyperborea, a phantom at the edge of Greek maps. Tartaria, too, drifts between fact and erasure, hovering in a twilight where absence itself becomes evidence. And in that twilight, artifacts emerge, objects that should not exist in the timelines we are told, relics that seem to point to knowledge and technology misplaced. They too raise the question, were we building anew or inheriting fragments of a civilization that had already been buried? Sometimes history hides not only in texts or maps, but in objects, mute fragments that seem out of place. We call them out-of-place artifacts, or OO parts, discoveries that appear too advanced, too refined, or too strange for the time to which they are assigned. For those who follow the trail of Tartaria, these artifacts are not accidents. They are the fingerprints of a civilization whose technology and knowledge were scattered when mud and silence closed over its cities. One recurring motif is energy. Across the vast spaces once labelled Tartary, architecture itself seems to double as technology. Onion domes gleam with metallic finishes, spires stretch like antennas, and colossal arches resonate like tuning forks. Alternative researchers propose that these were not merely decorative but functional, designed to harness atmospheric electricity or free energy from the ether. Though mainstream engineers dismiss the idea as pseudoscience, the resemblance between domes and later radio towers stirs curiosity. Could the domes have been more than symbols of faith? Could they have been the remnants of a forgotten power grid? Other artifacts add weight to the speculation. In the late 19th century, the Wardenclyffe Tower built by Nikola Tesla promised to transmit power wirelessly, a vision cut short by lack of funding and political resistance. For some, Tesla was not inventing from nothing but rediscovering principles once known to Tartaria. Ancient engravings of spheres and rods, the prevalence of star-shaped forts with geometric precision across Eurasia and beyond. These are interpreted as fragments of a technological language erased from textbooks but still etched into stone. Consider, too, the massive pipe organs found in cathedrals and civic halls across Europe and Russia. Officially instruments of music, their size and complexity are unmatched by modern equivalents. Conspiracy theorists suggest they may once have had a dual purpose, not only to fill vast spaces with sound, but to generate or modulate frequencies that harmonized with energy systems embedded in the architecture. To walk inside such a hall, with its towering columns and vaulted ceilings, is to feel as if one is inside a machine as much as a temple. Then there are smaller anomalies: precision-carved stone spheres in Central Asia, iron pillars that resist rust, legends of clockwork devices lost in fire or conquest. Each one can be explained, if one insists, natural geology, coincidence, ordinary craft. But together they form a mosaic of questions. Why do so many artifacts hint at knowledge we claim to have discovered only recently? Why do they appear most densely in regions once called Tartary? The Soviets, in their zeal to rewrite history, sometimes left curious gaps. Certain excavations were sealed, certain artifacts disappeared into museums without public record. Whispers circulated of discoveries that could not be reconciled with the official story. To bury the past is one thing, to bury objects that contradict it is another. Here, again, we sense the echo of a second erasure, not only of names and maps, but of matter itself. Artifacts alone cannot prove an empire, but they unsettle the story we tell ourselves. They are like buried windows in architecture, half visible, half hidden, suggesting that what lies below might change everything if revealed. And artifacts lead naturally into words. If stone and steel can preserve a ghost of Tartaria, so too can language. For even when maps were redrawn and mosques closed, languages carried whispers of an older identity, loanwords, proverbs, names that point to a homeland officially declared not to exist. Long after streets were buried and maps were redrawn, something fragile endured, the words people used. Language is one of the hardest things to erase. You can confiscate books, close schools, even ban alphabets, yet fragments remain in lullabies, proverbs, or casual turns of phrase. If Tartaria once existed as more than a cartographic convenience, then perhaps its last trace is not in stone, but in sound. The Tatar language itself holds a clue. Belonging to the Turkic family, it carries echoes that stretch across Central Asia, linking Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and even fragments of Mongolic speech. Place names across Russia bear Tatar roots: Kazan, Astrakhan, Tobolsk. To speak them aloud is to invoke a memory older than the Russian state, a reminder that these lands once belonged to another tongue. Even when the Soviet Union enforced Cyrillic alphabets, the sounds remained, stubborn as soil. Folklore preserves subtler signs. In Bashkir songs, heroes ride not merely across steppes, but through cities that sank beneath the earth. In Chuvash tales, mothers warn their children of a people who lived in towers higher than the sky until the ground claimed them. Linguists may classify such phrases as metaphor, but listeners hear resonance. A whisper of buried places, a cultural memory encoded in rhyme and rhythm. Loanwords in Russian also suggest layered inheritance. Everyday terms for tools, garments, and foods trace back to Tatar origins. Words for fortress, horse tack, even patterns of address reveal centuries of intermingling. If Tartaria was erased as a political identity, it was never fully erased from speech. Every borrowed syllable is a fossil of contact, an unacknowledged archive that defies decrees. Religious language adds another dimension. Quranic terms filtered into Turkic tongues, blending with local dialects to create unique hybrids. Soviet repression sought to cut these ties, replacing Arabic script with Latin, then Cyrillic. But the older forms never died completely. In private homes, elders recited prayers in original scripts long after they were outlawed. Language became an act of resistance, a way of keeping memory alive when history books betrayed it. Even in exile, the echoes persisted. Tatar communities displaced to Turkey or farther west carried their speech with them, preserving forms that Soviet policies sought to extinguish. Linguists comparing diaspora speech with homeland dialects find layers of preservation, archaisms that linger abroad, lost at home. In these anomalies, one might hear the last syllables of Tartaria. Language, like architecture, can be buried twice. Once in script, when alphabets are changed and books destroyed. Again in policy, when schools forbid native tongues. Yet like buried windows peeking above soil, fragments remain. A child overhears a lullaby. A traveller notices that a river's name does not fit the official map. A scholar finds a proverb whose origins lie in a culture officially declared never to have existed. If Tartaria survived anywhere, perhaps it is here, in the unbroken breath between generations, in words that resist silence. For even as mud-covered streets and ink-covered maps, voices still carried meaning forward. To erase them fully would require erasing the people themselves, and though empires tried, people endured. But enduring memory raises a haunting possibility. What if Tartaria was not simply erased once or twice, but in two distinct modes, one physical, one political? What if its true story is not only of burial, but of double burial, a civilization lost both in earth and in narrative? Imagine history as a manuscript written on fragile parchment. Once, long ago, an entire chapter was inked across its pages. Cities, cultures, technologies, and names that defined a world called Tartaria. Then came the first erasure, not with fire or conquest, but with earth itself. A flood of mud rolled over streets and squares, burying ground floors, turning doorways into basements, pressing arches beneath silence. The parchment was smudged, its ink blurred by soil. Yet still, fragments remained visible. Windows peeked above the ground, maps still bore the name, and memories lingered in language. Then came the second erasure, deliberate and calculated. In 1944, the Soviet Union ordered historians to revise Tatar history, to liquidate mistakes of a nationalistic character. Libraries withdrew texts, alphabets were changed, maps no longer carried the word Tartaria. By the mid-20th century, the very idea of Tartaria had been scrubbed, replaced with sanctioned narratives of Russia's destiny. This was not mud but ink, not accident but decree. The parchment was scraped clean, rewritten to serve power. Two erasures, one by nature, one by ideology. Together they form the pattern that defines Tartaria's mystery. If only the mud had buried it, the ruins might still speak clearly, uncovered by archaeology. If only the Soviets had buried it, older records might survive intact to contradict them. But with both layers combined, the silence is nearly complete. What mud obscured, politics denied. What politics denied, mud obscured. And yet, as with all palimpsests, traces survive. The CIA document of 1957, declassified decades later, preserved the forbidden word, like a ghost line of ink bleeding through. The buried windows of St. Petersburg preserved a visual reminder that ground levels once lay lower. Folk songs and proverbs preserved phrases that hinted at lands consumed by earth. None is definitive, all are suggestive. Together they whisper of a chapter once written, twice erased. For those who listen closely, the resonance between these erasures becomes hypnotic. Mud covering stone, ink covering memory. The motif repeats across centuries, burial upon burial, silence upon silence. What we call history may be less the truth of what happened and more the residue of what could not be completely hidden. And so we arrive at the threshold of the final part. Having traced Tartaria through soil, through maps, through decrees and documents, we stand before the silence that remains. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something folded, waiting. For even when buried twice, an echo still lingers. Night settles over the steppe, the horizon dissolving into a line of shadow. The air is still, heavy with the weight of centuries, and beneath it lies the silence of things forgotten. Tartaria, whether empire, cartographic fiction, or erased inheritance, does not shout its presence. It lingers instead like an after-image, faint yet insistent, folded into the margins of memory. We began with mud, streets half buried, windows peering from beneath soil, cities pressed downward as if the earth itself had chosen to smother them. We followed the phantom through maps, once bold with the name Tartaria, later drained of it, rewritten to serve new powers. We listened to myths of lands swallowed by storms, to languages carrying syllables older than their alphabets, to documents that preserved a forbidden word in sterile bureaucratic prose. Again and again, the motif returned: erasure, silence, and faint survival. The double burial is what defines Tartaria's enigma. First, the ground closed over its stones, then history closed over its name. Nature and politics conspired, or perhaps coincided, to fold it away from view. What remains are fragments: a photograph of a sunken window, a line on a 17th century atlas, a directive from 1944, a declassified report stamped CIA. None can prove Tartaria beyond doubt. Together they suggest a pattern too persistent to ignore. Yet perhaps Tartaria endures not in ruins or archives, but in us, in our need to remember what we are told to forget, in our instinct to search beneath surfaces. Every civilization leaves behind not only stones but questions, and the more thoroughly it is erased, the louder those questions become. Listen closely, and you may hear the silence breathe. A buried stairwell leading downward to a door, a prayer whispered in a forbidden tongue, a name struck from maps but still carried in stories. These are the portals through which the past leaks into the present, quiet but undeniable. Whether Tartaria was an empire of free energy, a loose label for the steppe, or something stranger, it now serves as mirror. It reflects our fragility, how quickly the earth can cover us, how easily words can be altered, how silently memory can be lost. It also reflects our resilience, how myths persist, how languages whisper, how ghosts of ink and stone refuse to vanish completely. And so the silence remains, not empty but full, like soil pressed against a buried window, waiting for light to find it again. Where are you listening from tonight, and at what time? Perhaps the echo of Tartaria is already with you, in the city beneath your feet, in the words you speak, in the mysteries you carry into sleep.